In honor of the exhibition Fashioning Insurrection, which we saw yesterday, let's start with an image of soldiers in uniform. Okay, so this photograph was taken in 1898 at the close of the 19th century, and we see 3 riders on horseback. The horses are all standing at attention, and the men sit up straight and calm in their saddles. Their uniform consists of wide-brimmed hats, dark flannel shirts, long gloves, and the man on the right is wearing a bandana tied around his neck. These riders are set against an unusual background. A massive brick structure with windows topped by horseshoe arches, punctuated by 2 domes and a tall tower rising up above the roofline. So, I'd like to pose to all of you a question. Where do you think this photograph was taken? Where in the world are we? The palm fronds that are peeking out from the left of frame suggest a warm climate, and the crescent on top of the dome to the right seems to place us somewhere in the Islamicate world. But, surprise, we're in Florida. So this is a photo of soldiers from the 1st Cavalry Regiment who were nicknamed the Rough Riders, led at the time by the then Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Teddy Roosevelt, who's already made an appearance today, who would go on, of course, to be the 26th President of the United States. Now, at the outbreak of the Spanish-American War, prompted by the sinking of the USS Maine in the harbor of Havana, the U.S. Army mustered this motley crew of cowboys, Native Americans, and Ivy League graduates to mount a response. It was decided that their base of operations would be the port city of Tampa, and more specifically, at a newly constructed hotel. While the officers bunked up in the suites, the infantry soldiers set up camp and performed their battle exercises on the extensive grounds of the resort. And the fact that a hotel in Tampa, Florida could be confused with a site in North Africa or the Middle East leads us to the main topic for today. So in this presentation, I want to focus on a fascinating moment of American-Islamic exchange that took place in Gilded Age America during the late 19th century. Our setting is the state of Florida, where a pair of railroad tycoons, Henry B. Plant and Henry Flagler, aka the 2 Henrys, which they were dubbed in the newspapers, constructed competing railroad lines on either side of the state, which opened up crucial transportation arteries that connected northern centers like New York and Chicago with shipping lanes to South America and the Caribbean. At the terminal points of these railroad lines, each magnate built luxury hotels, the main idea being to attract wealthy New Yorkers sick of gray winters to come spend the season in what was being marketed as the American Riviera, an unblemished tropical paradise, which to some extent may sound appealing right now in our present context. So, an illustrated volume put out in 1887 by the architecture firm Carrere and Hastings, whom Flagler hired to design the Ponce de Leon Hotel, serves essentially as an elaborate advertisement for the resort in St. Augustine. To those accustomed to apartments in northern cities, it is especially easy to throw off this bondage of winter and at less cost to find in Florida a more luxurious life, where a sun-warmed atmosphere replaces the baked air of anthracite furnaces, and where continuous bright days invite to healthful outdoor enjoyment. The change once made, a repetition becomes irresistible until a lifetime habit is formed, and the winter resident of Florida pities, while he wonders at, those whom he has left behind in the frozen north. Here are the vivid blue skies and brilliant sunshine of Egypt and of Spain, while the best-loved west wind sighs through the pine barrens with sweet and hollow tone, bearing to the invalid resinous and healing odors. Now, before the arrival of the railroad, Florida was largely rural, with the major urban settlements situated along the coast. So for people coming from northern hubs, like New York, Providence, Boston, Florida might as well have been on the other side of the world. And indeed, that is the point. Because in the quoted text here, the Florida sunshine is virtually interchangeable with that of Egypt or Spain. And perhaps even more significantly, in the mind of the author, Egypt and Spain are also interchangeable with one another. These hotels are noteworthy for our discussion about visual exchange between the Islamic world and the Americas because it represents a phenomenon that I describe as Florida Orientalism, a process by which the southeastern United States became an ersatz Orient in the American imagination, a place that served as a stand-in for places like Spain, North Africa, the Middle East, an exotic othered space. And what I'm calling this idea of Florida Orientalism can be seen in cinema, literature, and print media throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, but it was perhaps most spectacularly realized in the architecture of the region. So as I'm going to demonstrate in this presentation, it was a unique set of circumstances in the state of Florida. Expansion of transit networks, mass migration and tourism, and a settler colonial tradition available for exoticization that led to a proliferation of building projects inspired by the Islamic Mediterranean. And I argue that these buildings decked out with tiles, horseshoe arches, domes, and minarets are instrumental in understanding how the Sunshine State became a land of fantasy well before Walt Disney set his eyes on Orlando. And you'll see in just a minute, I'm kind of like the prequel for Enver's talk. So the material that I will be talking about today could be generally categorized as Orientalist architecture, a revivalist style that emerged in the mid-19th century and references historical architecture from the Islamic world in terms of decoration and structural form. The modern engagement with the historical architecture of the Islamicate world is, of course, by no means unique to Florida, as we can see in the various Masonic temples and movie theaters that can be found here in the United States. Beginning in the 19th century, alongside other modern revivalist styles, such as Gothic, Romanesque, or Neoclassical, Orientalist architecture spread throughout the globe and especially gained popularity in Europe and North America. So what's so special about Florida? Generally speaking, the two case studies of Florida resort hotels that we're going to look at today both include extensive campuses with a wide range of buildings and services, creating in effect a total themed environment. And I argue that this concept of theming is a critical and specific feature of Florida Orientalism, which is the impulse to construct on a massive scale entire physical worlds that appropriate historical architecture and cultural traditions for the bald purpose of entertainment and marketing. While architects and critics of the time tended to classify the style of these structures with labels like Saracenic or Moorish Revival, in this project I insist on the framework of Orientalism, not only for the sake of political correctness, but also because it prompts us to contend with these buildings in light of the post-colonial theory laid out most prominently by Edward Said that aims to understand how the West represents the East as the exotic other as a means of self-definition. Using Orientalism as a lens helps explain why modern architecture in Florida is often variously referred to as being in a Spanish, Mediterranean, or Moorish revival style. So from this perspective, buildings made out of brick and tile, punctuated with tall towers, become unstable signifiers that effectively make the geography of Spain interchangeable with, say, Morocco or Egypt in the minds of Americans in the late 19th century. And we can see firsthand how the slippage in architectural references works at the Ponce de Leon Hotel in St. Augustine. The main hotel building begun in 1885 and completed by 1887 on the order of Henry M. Flagler, the railroad magnate who was set on developing Florida's East Coast. For the project, he hired the up-and-coming New York architectural firm Carrere and Hastings. The hotel was the first major commission for the architects, John Mervyn Carrere and Thomas Hastings, and their success with this building catapulted them to fame in Gilded Age society, which led them to secure other major projects, perhaps most notably the New York Public Library in 1897. While their later constructions tended to be in the Beaux-Arts style that was prevalent in the Northeast US and was popularized by the 1893 Columbian Exposition, Carrere and Hastings constructed the Ponce de Leon Hotel in what they described as a Spanish Renaissance style. The architects explained their aesthetic decision in the aforementioned volume, Florida, the American Riviera. If, as has been remarked, climate is the king of architecture, then history is its queen, and I'm quoting from the text. A building can define neither the natural features of a place nor yet its associations. As we return to the Ponce de Leon, we see at once that neither Spain nor Florida are to be banished from us. The Ponce de Leon is built in the style of the early Spanish Renaissance, which was strongly influenced by the Moorish spirit. So in this reference to the history of Florida, Carrere and Hastings are pointing to the legacy of Spanish colonialism, and specifically to Juan Ponce de Leon, the conquistador who led the first official European expedition to Florida in 1513 and is of course credited with giving the state La Florida its name. And it is believed that Ponce de Leon's crew first landed at a site just north of St. Augustine, which in turn was established as a settlement several decades later in 1565. In other words, Carrere and Hastings selected the Spanish Renaissance style because it reflected the 16th century origins of St. Augustine, which served as the capital of the Spanish colony of Florida for 200 years and is recognized as the oldest continuously inhabited European settlement in what is today the contiguous United States. So while the label of Spanish Renaissance suggests that the architecture of this hotel would follow the more sober, monochrome aesthetic of 16th century Habsburg Spain, what visitors found on the ground in St. Augustine was a little more eclectic. And this is just an example of Habsburg Spain, the Palace of Charles V in Granada that was appended to the Alhambra. Okay, so this eclecticism is already hinted at when the architects emphasized that Spanish Renaissance architecture was strongly influenced by the Moorish spirit. And we're going to see on the ground how that works. And by the way, both the Ponce de Leon and Tampa Bay Hotel survived, but they now serve the same function as college campuses. So the Ponce de Leon is now Flagler College, and Tampa Bay Hotel now serves the University of Tampa. And the hotel visitors would have passed through a cast iron gate and found themselves in a large enclosed courtyard space. At the center of the courtyard is a large fountain with 12 frogs at its base surfing as water jets. And while I admit this is not like a perfect one-to-one comparison, I cannot help but look at this fountain and think of the courtyard of the Lions at the Alhambra, the 14th century palace of the Nasrid dynasty in Granada. And looking up from the courtyard, one sees two tall towers on either side, which again, look guys, it's not an exact match, but to my, that's kind of not, you have to squint a little bit. But to my eye, recalls the square minarets of Al-Andalus, such as the Giralda Tower, originally constructed in the 12th century as part of the Great Mosque of Sevilla, with a belfry added in the 16th century after its conversion to a cathedral. And I'm not the only one who's seeing a minaret here, okay? The writer of a popular travel guide to St. Augustine, which was published in 1897, only a few years after the hotel's construction, references that arched window and projecting corbelled balcony of the towers, and sees and says about this particular passage right here in the tower. He says, "These windows remind us of the balconies of Mohammedan mosques. And from them at morning, noon, or nightfall, we might at the hotel almost expect to hear the muezzin's call to prayer." Interestingly, the minaret theme continues behind the main building of the Ponce de Leon with a smokestack that I would say even more closely resembles a minaret, but in this case seems to be looking, for some reason, more at the slender minarets from the Ottoman realms, with a quotation of the 16th century minaret added to the rotunda in Thessaloniki, Greece, when what had originally been constructed as the tomb of the Roman Emperor Galerius was converted into a mosque. Turning now to our other case study for today in Tampa, we'll see an even more eclectic approach in the quotation and mixing of different architectural elements. A few years after Flagler's Hotel was built, the rival railroad tycoon Henry B. Plant commissioned his own resort hotel on the west coast of Florida, completed in 1891. For the hotel, Plant hired a lesser-known architect, John A. Wood, who was based in Poughkeepsie, New York. Most of Wood's commissions before the Tampa Bay Hotel, such as the Vassar Brothers Institute, was in this Victorian style that was really popularized in the Northeast U.S. by architects like Frank Furness, if anyone's from Philly. So in Tampa, Wood was certainly still working in the same basic architectural vocabulary of a brick building that integrates these machine work decorative elements. But here, there's certainly an effort to push this building into what was described at the time as a Moorish revival style, which was apparently at the request of Henry Plant, which he felt would be more attractive for the wealthy clients he was hoping to bring to his hotel. And the ephemera and advertisements for the Tampa Bay Hotel likewise lean into this exoticism, with one brochure that you see here going as far to promise Florida as a place where the local wildlife, the alligators, lounge about in orientalizing headgear and slippers. So Wood's designs thus explicitly underscore the strategy of framing Florida as a land of fantasy and recreation. This idea is especially evident in the long veranda that wraps around the entire length of the eastern side of the building that faces the hotel gardens and the Hillsborough River, where guests would while away many hours sitting on rocking chairs and sipping cold drinks. So for fun, here's a photo of some of those U.S. Army officers when they were using it as their base of operations down below. And the covering for the porch is distinguished by horseshoe arches, which is an architectural form that is one of the hallmark characteristics of Islamic architecture in Spain and North Africa. But there is a notable shift in materials. While the horseshoe arches of the Old World tend to be constructed of more solid stone and stucco, at the Tampa Bay Hotel they have been translated into a light wooden frame. Meanwhile, the other major feature of the hotel that marks it as being in a Moorish revival style are the several aluminum domes and 7 minarets that are all topped with golden crescents, which are so iconic that their silhouette has become a symbol that represents the city of Tampa itself. And despite the charge that these towers carry, I think that one would be very hard-pressed to find any minaret that looks like this in Islamic Spain or North Africa. And honestly, if anything, these bulbous toppers look more like something you'd find at a church in Kiev than in Al-Andalus. So when we compare the Hotel Ponce de Leon and the Tampa Bay Hotel side by side, while both traffic in the architectural language of the Islamic Mediterranean, the St. Augustine Resort by Currer and Hastings is much more academic in its citations, with clear references to the historical architecture of Spain, while Wood's Tampa Bay Hotel is it's like a total fantasy space. Nothing like this could be found on the ground in the Old World. And I would say that there are 2 reasons for these different approaches. First is the training of the respective architects. Both John Currer and Thomas Hastings were trained in the very traditional École des Beaux-Arts system in Paris, where they not only were drilled in the history of architecture, but they also had the opportunity to travel to places like Spain to really understand the language of a place's architecture as a total built environment. Meanwhile, John A. Wood described himself as a copybook eclectic in the sense that he would select architectural elements from different historical styles and mix them all together. The other reason I think that we see different approaches to Orientalist architecture in these 2 hotels is because of the different urban context for each monument. In St. Augustine, the Ponce de Leon was situated a stone's throw away from the very real and tangible traces of the city's colonial past, such as the Cathedral of St. Augustine and the early 18th century fortification of Matanzas, both only a block or 2 away from the hotel. But before Plant built his hotel, Tampa was a small little port town, and there was really no significant historical remains in the vicinity. So in this sense, unburdened by history, how nice, Wood was able to build whatever fever dream of a building that he wanted. And having said all that, one thing that these hotels do have in common is that they both quickly become theatrical backdrops for the denizens of St. Augustine and Tampa to play out their old world fantasies. It's essential to note that construction projects like these resort hotels were at least initially only accessible to relatively privileged individuals who were either wealthy or part of an aspiring middle class. Yet almost immediately after the construction, the hotels served as a scenery for festivals that would include the wider populace and allow for more working class people to participate in this collective myth-making and carnivalesque atmosphere. So in St. Augustine, the Ponce de Leon celebration, which involved the town's Anglo-American notables like A.W. Corbett dressing up as the major players in the founding of the Spanish colony, was established as part of the hotel's annual programming, while the Gasparilla Pirate Festival in Tampa began in 1904, only a few years after the hotel's initial construction, and continues to the present day. For over a century, the people of Tampa every year crown a royal court and then unpack our pistols, gold earrings, fake mustaches, and jaunty headscarves, I'm from Tampa, to play dress up and board a galleon that sails out into the bay and then turns around to reenact the invasion of Tampa by the legendary pirate Jose Gaspar. All of this taking place with the Tampa Bay Hotel functioning as the backdrop. And so it's with this notion of escapism that I wish to conclude. Through Orientalist architecture, Florida functioned for Americans as a portal, an escape to other faraway geographies like the Mediterranean or Middle East. From this perspective, it seems fitting that the state would eventually be selected a half century later to serve as a literal portal to other worlds, with the establishment of NASA's launch operations at Cape Canaveral. With this view of two hotels that began as the winter playgrounds of the wealthy in Florida, we gain unique insights into the intersections of Orientalism, architecture, and identity formation in Gilded Age America. Thank you.
Thank you very much.